There is a war happening right now, and most people don't even know they're in it. It's not being fought with weapons or armies. It's being fought inside your mind, with words, with silence, with carefully timed affection and precisely calculated cruelty, with looks that make you feel insane for noticing what you just noticed, with people who smile at you, while quietly dismantling your ability to trust yourself. This war has a name. It's called psychological manipulation. And the terrifying truth is that the most dangerous players in this game don't look like villains. They look like your partner, your boss, your closest friend. Sometimes they look like the most charming person in the room. This video is not about making you paranoid. It is about making you powerful. Because the single greatest defense against psychological manipulation is knowledge. Once you can see the game, you cannot be played by it. So, stay with us, because what you're about to learn might be the most important thing you've ever heard. Chapter 1. What dark psychology really is, and why you've already been a target. Let's start with a question that most people never think to ask. What exactly is dark psychology? Because if you type that phrase into a search engine, you'll find a flood of vague content about manipulation tactics and toxic people, but very few sources actually define it with precision. And if you don't understand what something truly is, you cannot protect yourself from it. So, let's be exact. Dark psychology is the study and application of psychological principles for the purpose of influencing, controlling, or exploiting another person's thoughts, emotions, behaviors, or perceptions without their knowledge or consent, and almost always against their own best interests. It is the deliberate weaponization of human psychology. Now that definition matters because it draws a very important line. Not all influence is dark psychology. A good teacher influences your thinking. A coach influences your behavior. A loving partner influences how you see the world. These are forms of social and emotional connection that are transparent, mutual, and ultimately beneficial to both people. Dark psychology is different. It is hidden. It is one-sided. And it is designed to serve the manipulator at the direct cost of the person being manipulated. That cost might be emotional, financial, social, or psychological. But there is always a cost. The target always pays. Now, here's the part that should stop you cold. You have already been a target. Not maybe, not possibly. You have. Every single person watching this has been on the receiving end of psychological manipulation at some point in their life. The only question is whether you recognized it at the time. And statistically, you almost certainly did not. That's not an insult. That is simply the nature of how these tactics work. They are designed to be invisible. They are built to feel normal, to feel like your own thoughts and feelings, not something being done to you. Think about a time when someone made you feel guilty for something you shouldn't have felt guilty about at all. Think about a moment when you walked away from a conversation feeling confused, smaller, or somehow like you had done something wrong, even though you couldn't quite name what. Think about a relationship, professional or personal, where you constantly found yourself second-guessing your own instincts, your own memory, your own judgment. That is not coincidence. That is not just a personality clash. In many of those moments, you were being played, and the person doing it may not have even been fully conscious of the techniques they were using. Some manipulators are deliberate architects of psychological warfare. Others have simply learned, through years of lived experience, that these behaviors get them what they want. Conscious or unconscious, the effect on you is the same. Here's what makes dark psychology so devastatingly effective. It exploits the very things that make you a good person. Your empathy is a weapon used against you. Your desire to be fair, your willingness to give the benefit of the doubt, your need for connection and belonging, every one of these beautiful human qualities becomes a point of entry for someone who knows how to exploit them. The kinder you are, the more trusting, the more emotionally intelligent, paradoxically, the more vulnerable you can be to manipulation if you don't also develop the ability to recognize when those qualities are being used against you. This is why dark psychology tends to target high-functioning, emotionally sensitive, and deeply empathetic people more than most. Not because they are weak, precisely because they are strong in the ways that matter to real human connection. And the manipulator feeds on that strength. So before we go any further, there is something you need to permanently install in your mindset. Knowing that manipulation exists, knowing what it looks like, and knowing how to respond to it does not make you cynical or cold. It does not mean you have to stop trusting people or close your heart. What it means is that your trust becomes intelligent. Your empathy becomes protected. Your kindness becomes a choice, not a vulnerability. The goal of everything in this video is not to turn you into a suspicious, guarded, emotionally shut down version of yourself. The goal is to turn you into someone who is genuinely free, someone who can connect deeply, trust wisely, and walk away from anyone who tries to use your own humanity as a weapon against you. Now, let's start breaking down exactly how they do it. Because the more specifically you understand each tactic, the more power you reclaim. And we're starting with one of the most insidious, most widespread, and most psychologically devastating forms of manipulation ever identified. Chapter 2. Gaslighting. When someone makes you question your own reality. Imagine this. You're in a relationship, romantic, professional, or even a friendship, and something happens that bothers you. Maybe the other person said something cruel. Maybe they broke a promise. Maybe they did something that clearly crossed a boundary you had both agreed on. So you bring it up. You say, calmly and clearly, that what happened wasn't okay. And they look at you with this expression of complete bewilderment. And then they say one of the following things. That never happened. Or, you're being too sensitive. Or, I never said that. You're imagining things. Or, you always do this. You always twist everything. Or maybe simply, you're crazy. And here's what happens next. And this is the part that is crucial to understand. You start to wonder if they're right. You go back through the memory. You question your own perception of the event. You think, maybe I misheard. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe I'm being unfair. Maybe I am a little paranoid. And little by little, conversation by conversation, incident by incident, you stop trusting yourself. You stop relying on your own senses, your own memory, your own emotional responses as valid data. You start outsourcing your reality to someone whose entire strategy depends on you not being able to trust your own mind. That is gaslighting. And it is one of the most psychologically destructive things one human being can do to another. The term comes from a 1944 film called Gaslight, in which a husband systematically manipulates his wife into doubting her own sanity by, among other things, dimming the gas-powered lights in their home and then insisting the lights haven't changed at all when she notices. He is not just lying to her. He is engineering a reality in which her perception of the world becomes unreliable to her. He is making the truth itself feel unstable. This is exactly what gaslighting does in real life. And it doesn't have to be as dramatic as the film. In fact, the most common forms of gaslighting are quiet and cumulative. They build slowly over time. So slowly that by the time you realize how lost you are, you can barely remember what it felt like to trust yourself. Let's look at the specific techniques gaslighters use, because naming them is the first step to diffusing them. The first is flat denial. This is the most direct form. You say, "You told me you would be there." They say, "I never said that." Full stop, no elaboration. Just a clean, confident rejection of your memory. And because they say it with such certainty, because there's no hesitation, no guilt, no flinching, you begin to wonder if perhaps you heard wrong. You didn't. But the confidence with which they deny it is designed to override your confidence in your own recollection. The second technique is minimization. This is when they don't deny the thing happened, but they completely dismiss the significance of it and, more importantly, of your response to it. You're making a big deal out of nothing. You're too emotional. You're so dramatic. Other people would just let this go. This technique is particularly effective because it attacks not just your perception of events, but your reaction to them. It makes you feel that even if the thing happened, the problem is you for caring about it. Over time, you learn to suppress your emotional responses before they can be dismissed again. You start minimizing yourself before someone else can do it for you. And when that happens, the gaslighter has won a permanent victory because now you are doing their work for them. The third technique is diversion. When confronted, the gaslighter shifts the conversation to something entirely different, usually to your character or behavior in some other context. Why are you always bringing up problems? Every time I try to have a good day, you start with this. You want to talk about problems. Let's talk about what you did last week. Suddenly, you are no longer discussing the original issue. Now you are defending yourself. Now you are the one explaining and justifying. The original grievance disappears into the noise, and the gaslighter escapes accountability entirely. The fourth technique is counter-accusation. This is the escalated version of diversion. Not only do they deflect, they turn the entire dynamic around. You become the abuser. You become the unreasonable one, the controlling one, the one who is hurting them by even raising the issue. "I can't believe you would accuse me of that after everything I do for you." This is emotional abuse, what you're doing to me. This technique is devastating because it creates profound guilt and confusion in someone who genuinely doesn't want to hurt anyone. And it's especially effective on empathetic people, precisely because they take the accusation seriously. They stop and genuinely ask themselves, "Am I the problem?" And while they're asking that question, the gaslighter slips away free. The fifth technique is the social extension of gaslighting, which is recruiting others. Advanced gaslighters don't just work on you one-on-one. They build what is sometimes called a chorus of confirmation. They spend time before and after conflicts telling mutual friends, family members, or colleagues a version of events that casts you as unstable, irrational, or difficult. So when you eventually reach out to someone in your social circle for validation, you find that they already see you through the lens the gaslighter has prepared for them. "Oh," she said, "you've been going through a hard time and getting paranoid. He mentioned you've been really stressed and taking it out on people. Now, not only are you doubting yourself, but the people around you are doubting you too." The gaslighter has outsourced the work. So how do you protect yourself? The answer is documentation and grounding. Document things, not because you are building a legal case, but because written records, dated messages, saved emails, and even private journal entries give your memory an anchor. Gaslighting works by making your memory feel slippery and unreliable. A written record makes it solid. When you can go back and see, in your own words, what was said and when, the manipulator's confident denials lose their power. Ground yourself in the responses of trusted outside voices, not to seek permission for your feelings, but to reality check your perception. If you describe a situation to 3 people whose judgment you trust, and all 3 of them say, "That sounds really messed up," you are allowed to trust that. You are not paranoid. You are not dramatic. You are not crazy. If your gut has been saying something is wrong for weeks or months, and you keep talking yourself out of it, the issue is not your gut. The issue is who has been teaching you not to listen to it. And here is the most important principle of protection against gaslighting. Your feelings are not conclusions, but they are valid data. You do not have to have airtight proof that something happened to be allowed to feel hurt by it. You do not have to win a debate to know that something is wrong. The moment a person in your life consistently makes you feel like your perception of reality is broken, that person is the problem, regardless of how confident, charming, or certain they seem. Trust yourself first. Verify later. But never let someone override your senses so completely that you forget they ever spoke. Chapter 3. Love bombing and devaluation, the sweetest trap ever built. You meet someone, and it feels like nothing you've ever experienced before. They pursue you with an intensity that is almost overwhelming. They text you constantly. They tell you, within days or weeks, that you are extraordinary, that you are different from anyone they've ever met, that they've never felt this way before. They make grand gestures. They make plans for the future. They seem to really see you in a way that nobody else ever has. They say things like, "I've been waiting for someone like you my whole life." They seem completely captivated, obsessed even, and you think, finally someone who actually gets me. Finally, someone who shows up the way I've always wanted to be shown up for. Finally, this, what you don't know yet, is that you have just walked into the most expertly designed trap in the psychological manipulation playbook. What you have just experienced is called love bombing, and the purpose of it has absolutely nothing to do with love. Love bombing is the process of overwhelming someone with excessive affection, attention, flattery, and apparent devotion in the early stages of a relationship, with the deliberate or subconscious goal of creating emotional dependency, bypassing the natural development of trust, and making the target feel so profoundly chosen and seen that they become bonded before they've had the chance to evaluate whether this person is actually safe, healthy, or genuine. It is the emotional equivalent of being handed an addictive substance before you know it's addictive. By the time the effect kicks in, you're already dependent. And here's what makes it so extraordinarily cruel. It feels exactly like the real thing. Healthy, passionate love can also move fast. Real connection can feel intense and extraordinary. The difference is not in the velocity. The difference is in the purpose and what comes next. Because with love bombing, what comes next is devaluation. After the bombing phase, which can last days, weeks, months, or even longer depending on the manipulator's style and patience, something shifts. It's rarely dramatic at first. It's a subtle change in temperature. The texts slow down. The warmth becomes inconsistent. One day they're back to being the person who made you feel like the center of the universe. The next day they're cold, dismissive, or subtly critical. They start noticing things about you that need to be fixed. The qualities they once celebrated become the very things they now find irritating. You're too sensitive. You're too needy. You were so much more fun before. And the most damaging part of this phase is what it triggers in you. Because you have been emotionally conditioned to associate this person with the highest highs you've ever felt. So when the warmth withdraws, your entire psychological system goes into overdrive trying to get it back. You work harder. You apologize more. You shrink yourself. You try to become whoever they need you to be in this moment. You chase the version of them you fell in love with, not realizing that version was a performance, not realizing you are now running in a maze designed to keep you running. This cycle, love bombing, then devaluation, then occasional returns to warmth, just frequent enough to keep you hooked, is the central emotional engine of narcissistic abuse. And it is extraordinarily effective because it is rooted in one of the most powerful mechanisms in human psychology, the variable reward schedule. Variable reward is the same principle that makes slot machines so addictive. When a reward is predictable, we stop being emotionally activated by it. We take it for granted. But when a reward is inconsistent, when it comes sometimes, but not always, on no clear schedule, seemingly at random, we become obsessed with pursuing it. We keep pulling the lever. We keep trying. We keep working to figure out the formula that will bring the reward back. In the context of a relationship, the reward is affection, validation, warmth, and when it is given unpredictably, withdrawn without explanation, and reintroduced just when you're about to give up, the psychological effect is consuming. You become bonded not to a person who is genuinely good for you, but to the cycle itself, to the hope of the next high. This is not weakness on your part. This is chemistry. This is neurobiology. These cycles create measurable changes in the dopamine and cortisol systems in your brain. The highs are genuinely euphoric. The withdrawals are genuinely painful. And the result is a kind of trauma, bonding and attachment that is inverse in its intensity to the safety and health of the relationship. The more painful and unpredictable it is, the more powerfully attached you become. And this is exactly what the manipulator, consciously or not, has engineered. So, how do you protect yourself from love bombing and devaluation? The first and most critical protection is this. Slow is not a rejection. Speed is not a sign of love. When someone pursues you with overwhelming intensity, very early in a relationship, before real trust, shared history, and genuine knowledge of each other have been built, that intensity is a signal worth examining. Not necessarily a red flag in isolation, but a reason to slow down. A reason to watch what happens when you don't immediately meet their intensity with equal intensity. Because genuine love withstands a pace that allows both people to see each other clearly. A manipulator's performance does not. Pay attention to how they respond when things don't go their way. When you have a bad day, or you're not in a good mood, or you're not giving them the admiring attention they're used to, how do they respond? Do they show care and understanding? Or do they withdraw, punish, or become irritable? That response will tell you more about who they are than months of perfect dates ever will. Watch for the pattern of inconsistency. Love bombers are not consistently wonderful people who occasionally have bad days. They are people whose behavior oscillates between extremes in ways that have no clear external cause. The shift is internal. It's strategic, and if you chart it over time, you'll find it follows the cycle. Pursue, bond, devalue, restore, repeat. See the cycle. Name the cycle. Because once you can see it clearly, you can step out of it. And finally, protect your self-concept fiercely during a relationship. If you find that over the course of months, with someone your confidence has shrunk rather than grown, your sense of self has become blurrier rather than clearer, and your emotional state has become more dependent on their moods than your own. Those are not small things. A person who genuinely loves you makes you more yourself, not less. They do not require you to become smaller to make room for their performance. Chapter 4. Darvo, how abusers turn the tables and make themselves the victim. There is a moment that almost anyone who has ever been in a relationship with a manipulative person knows intimately. You've done it. You've worked up the courage, the clarity, the emotional energy to confront them. You've chosen your words carefully. You've told yourself you're not going to be deflected this time. You're going to hold your ground. You're going to say what needs to be said, and you are going to be heard. And then you say it. And within seconds, not minutes, seconds, you're no longer the one confronting. You're the one defending. Somehow, in the space of a few sentences, you have become the villain. They are hurt. They are shocked. They are the wounded party. You are the aggressor. And you don't quite understand how you got here. But here you are, comforting the person who just caused you harm, apologizing for bringing it up, trying to convince them that you don't think they're a terrible person, while your original grievance sits completely unaddressed on the floor between you. What just happened to you has a name. It's called Darvo. And once you understand it, you will never be trapped in that moment the same way again. Darvo stands for deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. It is a response pattern identified by clinical psychologist Jennifer Freyd, and it describes a specific, highly recognizable sequence of behavior that manipulators particularly those with narcissistic or abusive tendencies, use when they are held accountable for their actions. And the reason it works so devastatingly well is that it exploits the exact moment when you are at your most emotionally invested, the moment when you actually care enough to speak up. Let's break the acronym down in full detail, because understanding each component is essential to recognizing when it's being used on you in real time. The first move is deny. The manipulator's immediate response to any confrontation is flat, confident, often indignant denial. Not a considered denial. Not a "let me think about that." A reflexive, immediate, total rejection of the premise. "I never did that. That's not what happened. You're completely wrong." The speed and certainty of the denial is deliberate, whether they know it or not. It is designed to make you feel, before the conversation has even properly started, that you are on shaky ground. Because most people, when faced with an absolutely certain denial from someone they're in a relationship with, start to second-guess themselves. They think, if they're that sure, maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe I'm being unfair. That moment of self-doubt is the crack the manipulator slips through. The second move is attack. Once the denial has been placed, the manipulator immediately shifts from defense to offense. Now you, for raising the issue, are the problem. How could you accuse me of that? Do you have any idea how hurtful it is for me to be accused like this? I can't believe you'd think so little of me, after everything I've done for you. The attack can be delivered with cold fury, with theatrical hurt, with trembling indignation, or with contemptuous dismissal, depending on the manipulator's preferred emotional register. But the purpose is always the same: to make the act of confronting them feel like the crime, rather than the behavior you were confronting them about. And it is extraordinarily effective, especially on empathetic people, because an empathetic person hears another person express pain, and they respond to it. Their nervous system responds to it, even when the pain being expressed is strategically manufactured, even when the hurt is a performance. The empathetic person's instinct to not cause suffering kicks in. The third move is the most psychologically sophisticated of all: reverse victim and offender. This is the completion of the inversion. Now, they are the real victim here. You are the real perpetrator. You have hurt them by accusing them. You have damaged the relationship by bringing this up. Your behavior in raising this concern is abusive, unfair, paranoid, controlling, unkind. And they, who did the original harmful thing, are now suffering because of your cruelty in confronting them about it. The victim and offender have been formally swapped, and you are now managing their emotional pain instead of resolving the original harm. The original issue has completely disappeared. They have escaped accountability, not just without consequence, but having extracted an apology from the person they harmed. This is manipulation operating at a masterful level, and it doesn't require genius. It doesn't require calculated deliberation in the moment. For many manipulators, this is simply a deeply practiced reflex, a survival mechanism that was learned so early and used so often that it is now automatic, which doesn't make it less harmful to you, but it does help explain why it can feel so natural and seamless when it's happening. What makes Darvo particularly insidious is the long-term effect it has. Because if you are in a relationship where Darvo is the consistent response to any attempt at accountability, Over time, you simply stop trying. You stop raising issues. You stop naming problems. You decide, consciously or not, that it's not worth the cost. And when that happens, the manipulator has achieved something profound. They have made themselves completely unaccountable, not through explicit threat or force, but by making the act of confronting them more painful than whatever harm they caused. You are now self-silencing. They don't even need to do the work anymore. You are doing it for them. How do you protect yourself from Darvo? The most powerful tool is preparation and documentation. Before you enter a confrontation with someone who has used this pattern before, write down clearly, in advance, what happened, how it affected you, and what you need. Not to read from a script, though sometimes that helps, but so that the original issue exists on paper, anchored outside your head. Because when the attack and reversal come, your mind will be flooded with emotion and confusion. Having the original issue written down means you can return to it. You can hold it. You can say, I hear that you feel hurt by this conversation. I also know that I came here to discuss a specific thing, and I need to stay on that. Learn to name Darvo when it happens, out loud, calmly, without accusation. I notice that we started talking about X, and we've now shifted to my character. I want to come back to X. You don't need to call it Darvo by name. You just need to gently, persistently keep bringing the conversation back to the original issue. A manipulator using Darvo will escalate, redirect, and dramatize. Your job is not to match their energy. Your job is to maintain the thread of the original conversation with quiet, unshakable consistency, and understand that someone who consistently uses Darvo when confronted is not someone who has the capacity or the willingness to be accountable. You cannot love them into accountability. You cannot argue them into it. You cannot find the right words that will make them finally see. If Darvo is the consistent pattern, the protection is not a better confrontation strategy. The protection is distance. Chapter 5. Social proof manipulation: how crowds are used as weapons against you. Human beings are deeply, profoundly, and inescapably social animals. This is not a character flaw. It is one of the most brilliant features of our species. Our ability to take social cues from each other, to calibrate our behavior based on the behavior of the group, to learn from collective experience rather than having to discover everything alone. This is the mechanism that allowed small, relatively fragile creatures with no claws, no fangs, and no natural armor to become the most dominant species on the planet. Social proof, the instinct to look at what other people believe and do as a guide for what we should believe and do, is one of the foundational pillars of human civilization. And it is one of the most weaponized psychological mechanisms in the manipulator's entire arsenal. Here is how it works at its most basic level. When you are unsure how to behave, what to believe, or how to evaluate a situation, you look to others. You look at how people around you are reacting, what the group consensus seems to be, what the majority of voices in your environment appear to think. And this is entirely rational. Social information is real information. If you walk into a restaurant and every table is full, that is data. If you walk into a restaurant and there are 2 people sitting nervously near the door, that is also data. The crowd is telling you something, and it would be foolish not to listen at all. But what happens when the crowd has been manufactured? What happens when the consensus has been staged? What happens when the voices of authority or agreement around you have been specifically arranged by someone who wants to use your natural social instincts to control you? That is social proof manipulation, and it is everywhere. It operates at the scale of global propaganda campaigns and at the scale of a single toxic relationship. The mechanics are identical. Only the arena changes. Let's start at the personal level, because this is where most people are most vulnerable and least defended. One of the most common forms of social proof manipulation in personal relationships is what's sometimes called the tribunal dynamic. This is when a manipulator, before or after a conflict with you, works to build a consensus in your social circle that positions you in an unfavorable light. They tell the story first. They frame the events in a way that makes their behavior reasonable and yours suspicious, irrational, or hurtful. And because they got there first, because they built the frame before you had the chance to share your perspective, the people around you have already formed an impression. When you eventually try to talk about what happened, you find the conversation strangely resistant. People seem already to have an opinion. They seem sympathetic to the other person in ways you don't quite understand. You sense a wall, even from people you thought you could trust. This is not paranoia. This is social proof manipulation in action. The crowd that you were going to turn to for reality testing has already been preloaded with a narrative that serves your manipulator's interests. A related technique is what's known as triangulation through social proof using a third party, real or implied, to validate the manipulator's position and undermine yours. I talked to my sister about this, and she thinks you're being unreasonable. My entire friend group couldn't believe it when I told them what you did. Even your own mother said you have a problem with overreacting. Whether or not these conversations actually happened, whether or not they happened the way the manipulator is describing, the effect is the same. Suddenly, you are not just disagreeing with one person, you are disagreeing with a crowd. And our instinct, deep and powerful, is to assume that when enough people agree, the probability is that they are right. So we defer. We soften our position. We wonder if perhaps we should reconsider. We yield not because we've been reasoned into it, but because the social weight feels too great to resist. At a larger scale, social proof manipulation is the core mechanism of cult dynamics, propaganda systems, and authoritarian social control. The key feature is always the same: the engineering of apparent consensus. Not the existence of genuine agreement, but the appearance of it. And the appearance is enough. The appearance is usually enough. In online environments, social proof manipulation has achieved an efficiency and scale that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Manufactured approval in the form of inflated metrics, coordinated mass response campaigns, and the deliberate amplification of minority positions to make them appear mainstream are now standard tools of influence operations, marketing strategies, and political campaigns. When you see a certain idea, candidate, product, or belief appearing constantly across all your feeds, being endorsed by people across your social network, generating overwhelming apparent consensus, the reflex is to assume that this is organic, that this reflects reality, that this many people can't possibly be wrong, but they can. And in many cases, it is not even people whose responses you are seeing. It is an engineered social environment designed to feel like a crowd. The deeper you understand this principle, the more clearly you see that the question is never simply, what does everyone else think? The question is always, who arranged for everyone to think this? And what do they gain by me believing it? How do you protect yourself from social proof manipulation? The first defense is developing what might be called independent epistemology. That is a complex phrase for a simple idea. Knowing how you know what you know. Before you accept a belief, before you change your position on something, before you defer to an apparent consensus, ask yourself, what is the actual evidence here? Not what is the social weight of the position, not how many people seem to believe it. What is the actual, verifiable, direct evidence? Social proof tells you what the crowd believes. Evidence tells you what is true. These are not the same thing, and confusing them is exactly what the manipulator needs you to do. The second defense is temporal separation. When you are in conflict with someone and they deploy social proof, everyone agrees with me. I talk to all our friends and they all think you're wrong. Do not respond to the social claim in not the heat of the moment. Take the time, separately and without that person's influence, to talk to those individuals directly, not to build a counter-coalition, not to win a political battle, simply to get unmediated information, to hear for yourself, from the source, what those people actually think, in their own words, without another person having pre-framed the conversation. Third, build a small, trusted inner circle of people who have no relationship with your manipulator. People outside the social ecosystem where the manipulation is happening. People who can offer you a clean perspective, not because they know all the details, but because they know you well enough and have good enough judgment to tell you honestly whether what you're describing sounds like something is wrong. When your social world has been infiltrated and preloaded with a narrative, you need at least some anchors outside that world. And finally, remember this: genuine consensus doesn't need to be announced. When something is truly agreed upon by the people in your life, you know it over time, through organic conversation, through consistent behavior, through the quiet weight of shared experience. When someone is telling you that everyone agrees with them, performing the consensus rather than letting you encounter it naturally, that performance is itself information. It tells you that the consensus may not be as real as it's being presented, and it tells you that someone needs you to believe it is. That need is worth examining very carefully. Chapter 6. False Scarcity and Urgency. The clock that was never real. There is a pressure that most of us have felt at some point, in some form, that is almost impossible to describe from the outside, but completely recognizable the moment you're inside it. It is the feeling that you have to decide now, that if you don't act immediately, something will be lost, that the window is closing, and if you hesitate even a moment too long, you will miss something you cannot get back. This feeling has a physical dimension. You feel it in your chest. You feel it in the way your thoughts suddenly become less clear, less patient, less capable of stepping back and asking the question that would protect you the most. Is this actually as urgent as it feels? The answer, far more often than you realize, is no. The urgency is constructed, the scarcity is manufactured, and you are being moved toward a decision before your rational mind has had the time to catch up with your emotional one. This is the tactic of false scarcity and false urgency. and it is one of the most widely used, most comprehensively researched, and most potent manipulation strategies in existence. It is used by predatory salespeople, by authoritarian leaders, by abusive partners, by high-pressure recruiters, and by every algorithm on every social media platform that has ever shown you a countdown timer. The scale changes. The psychology does not. To understand why it works so effectively, you have to understand a fundamental principle of human decision-making. We are built to prioritize loss over gain. This is one of the most robustly replicated findings in behavioral psychology and behavioral economics, associated particularly with the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Human beings are roughly twice as emotionally activated by the prospect of losing something as they are by the prospect of gaining the equivalent thing. Losing $20 hurts approximately twice as much as gaining $20 feels good. This asymmetry is not irrational. Evolutionarily, it made perfect sense. In an environment of genuine scarcity, the organism that responded more urgently to potential losses survived more reliably than one that was equally motivated by gains and losses. The problem is that we now live in an environment that is nothing like the one that shaped this psychological architecture. And manipulators know how to reach back into that ancient wiring and pull. When a manipulator deploys false scarcity, they are doing something very specific. They are creating the perception, sometimes entirely fictional, that a resource, opportunity, relationship, or state of affairs is limited in availability, and that you are in danger of losing access to it. This activates your loss aversion system. Suddenly, your decision-making process is not calm, considered, and thorough. It is driven by the desire to not lose the thing. And when loss aversion is running the show, critical thinking takes a back seat. When false urgency is layered on top of this, the effect is compounded. Now, not only is the thing scarce, but the window in which you can act is closing. The combination of scarcity and urgency effectively jams the neural circuitry that would otherwise give you the space to ask, do I actually want this? Is this genuinely as good as it's being presented? What am I not being told? What happens if I say no and wait? The manipulator needs those questions to not be asked. So they create conditions in which there is no time for questions. They manufacture a crisis that demands an immediate answer. And then they stand at the exit of that crisis, holding whatever it is they want you to agree to. In commercial and financial contexts, the signs of this tactic are relatively easy to spot once you know the pattern. This price is only available for the next 20 minutes. We only have 3 of these left. I have another buyer who's very interested. This opportunity closes at midnight. These are among the most commonly deployed false urgency triggers in existence, and research consistently shows that they work even when people are consciously aware that they might be manipulative. The emotional system responds before the rational one can intervene. But here is where it becomes much darker and much harder to recognize. The same tactic is deployed with devastating effect in personal and intimate relationships. And, in those contexts, it is far less obviously manufactured. A controlling partner who senses you are pulling away may suddenly present a crisis, emotional, financial, physical, relational, that demands your immediate attention and prevents you from following through on creating distance. An emotionally manipulative friend may choose the exact moment you are considering whether the relationship is worth maintaining to appear in their most desperate state, triggering your caretaking instinct and making it feel cruel and impossible to step back right now. A manipulative employer may consistently create situations in which there is always an emergency, always a deadline, always a reason you cannot possibly take time for your own needs right now, establishing a permanent atmosphere of urgency that keeps you reactive, exhausted, and unable to think clearly about what you actually want. In each of these cases, the manufactured urgency is not about a real crisis. It is about preventing you from thinking. And the prevention of thinking is always in service of something the manipulator wants but could not get if you had time to be calm and deliberate about it. The protection against this tactic begins with a single, deceptively simple practice: pausing, deliberately, consciously, and sometimes in defiance of enormous social pressure, choosing not to decide right now. Because here is the truth that the manipulator does not want you to know. Almost nothing that is actually good for you requires you to decide in the next 5 minutes. Real opportunities can withstand a 24-hour pause. Real relationships can withstand a conversation you postpone by a day to think clearly. Real emergencies, genuine ones, have a quality of specificity and verifiability that manufactured ones do not. When someone is pressuring you to decide immediately and growing frustrated or distressed by your request for time, that frustration is information. It tells you that the decision they want from you does not serve your interests. If it served your interests, they would have no reason to fear your careful consideration of it. Ask yourself the question that false urgency is specifically designed to prevent you from asking, what happens if I wait? If the honest answer is probably nothing terrible, you have your answer about how real the urgency is. Chapter 7. Guilt Tripping and Obligation Loops. The Invisible Chains. There are relationships, and many people reading this will recognize them immediately, where you spend more time managing your guilt than you do actually enjoying the connection, where you find yourself going along with things not because you want to, not because you've thought it through, not because you've made a free, deliberate choice, but because the alternative is a particular kind of emotional weight that has come to feel unbearable, where you agree to things, give things, sacrifice things, not from generosity, but from the desperate desire to make that weight go away. That relationship has a mechanism at its center. That mechanism is guilt tripping, and the weight you're feeling is not your conscience. It is a chain that someone else put there. Understanding the difference between genuine guilt and manipulated guilt is one of the most important psychological distinctions a person can make. Because genuine guilt is a healthy and necessary human experience. It is the signal your moral compass sends when your actions have genuinely violated your values or harmed someone you care about. That guilt has a purpose. It motivates repair, accountability, and growth. It points clearly at something you did and says, "This was wrong, and you have the capacity to make it right." Genuine guilt is clean, even when it's painful. It has a shape and a resolution. Manipulated guilt is something else entirely. It is diffuse rather than specific. It is permanent rather than resolvable. No matter what you do, no matter how much you give, no matter how completely you contort your life to address it, it does not go away. Because it was never about your actual wrongdoing. It was placed there to control your behavior. And a control mechanism, by design, does not release you when you've done enough. It releases you only when it needs to, and only just enough to keep you in the loop. Let's look at the specific tools of the guilt tripper in detail, because Recognizing them in real time is what breaks their power. The first tool is the suffering display. This is when the manipulator communicates through words, body language, sighs, silences, or tears that they are suffering as a result of your actions or your choices. The suffering may be real, the pain may be genuine, but the purpose of communicating it in this specific way, at this specific moment, is not to share vulnerability. It is to create a connection in your mind between your behavior and their pain. Every time you do this, I feel so hurt. I just feel like I'm not a priority to you. Sometimes I wonder if you even care about what this does to me. These statements are delivered not as invitations to honest as Croston's dialogue, but as emotional invoices. You are expected to pay. The currency is compliance. The second tool is the sacrifice inventory. This is the explicit or implicit recounting of everything the manipulator has done for you, everything they have given up, everything they have endured, deployed at the moment when you are being asked to do something you are hesitant about or declining. After everything I've done for you, I gave up so much to be here for you. I've never asked you for anything. I've always supported you. And now, when I need this one thing, the purpose is to create a ledger in your mind where their contributions are elevated and your needs, objections, or limits become the evidence of your ingratitude or selfishness. The ledger is almost never accurate, and even when some of the entries on it are real, they do not constitute a debt that obligates you to abandon your own needs or judgment. But the ledger triggers something, the desire to be fair, to not be the kind of person who takes without giving, and the manipulator exploits that desire with precision. The third tool is the hypothetical victim. This is when the manipulator frames your choice as one that will cause direct harm to them or to others. If you don't do this, I don't know what will happen to me. I just won't be okay if you're not there. Do you realize what this is going to do to the family? The hypothetical victim strategy is particularly insidious because it is almost impossible to counter without seeming cruel. How do you say, "Your potential suffering is not my responsibility," to someone who is presenting themselves as devastatingly vulnerable, especially when you care about them, especially when you genuinely don't want them to suffer? The answer is not easy, but it matters, because a person who consistently uses the threat of their own suffering to prevent you from exercising your own autonomy has made your autonomy a hostage. The fourth tool is the obligation loop, which is the structure that holds all the other tools in place. An obligation loop is created when a manipulator establishes a pattern in which your receipt of something, their time, their affection, their help, their approval is consistently and always followed by a demand that creates a debt. The gifts are never free. The help is never unconditional. Every act of apparent generosity is a deposit into an account that will be called in later, at a moment and in an amount the manipulator determines. And the loop closes because refusing to pay the debt, refusing to honor the obligation, results in a withdrawal of the very things that made the relationship feel worth maintaining. You give and give, because if you don't, you lose access to the warmth and connection that were offered to you in the first place. You are essentially renting their goodwill at the price of your freedom. Here is the most clarifying lens you can apply to any relationship where you suspect this dynamic. Ask yourself whether your acts of giving feel chosen or compelled, whether you give from a place of genuine desire to contribute to someone's life, or from a place of fear about what happens if you don't. Love, real love, whether romantic, familial, or between friends, does not require compulsion. It does not require you to manage someone else's feelings at the expense of your own integrity. It does not present you with a suffering display every time you attempt to say no. The protection against guilt-tripping and obligation loops begins with relearning the meaning of no. No is a complete sentence. No is not a wound. No is not a betrayal. No is not a measure of how much you care about someone. Your right to set limits on what you will do, where you will go, what you will give, is not something that can be legitimately taken from you by the force of another person's emotional reaction to it. When you feel guilt in the absence of actual wrongdoing, when you feel obligated in the absence of a choice you freely made, you are not experiencing your conscience. You are experiencing a trained response that someone else installed. And trained responses can be uninstalled. It takes time. It takes practice. It takes support, sometimes professional. But it begins with recognizing the difference between the weight of genuine responsibility and the weight of someone else's manipulation. Chapter 8. Isolation Tactics. How Manipulators Cut the Wires. There is a progression that almost every survivor of a psychologically abusive relationship describes when they look back. It didn't start dramatically. It didn't start with obvious control or explicit demands. It started with small, individually reasonable-seeming movements that, over months or sometimes years, had the cumulative effect of narrowing the world. Friends seen less often. Family gatherings attended with increasing tension and decreasing frequency. Colleagues kept at a careful professional distance. Activities and hobbies that once provided independent identity and joy gradually let go. First reluctantly, then almost automatically. Until one day, and this day often comes as a genuine shock, they look around and realize that the person who has been causing them harm is also the only person in their life. Every social wire has been cut. Every exit is blocked. The support network that might have provided perspective, reality checking, or a safe place to land no longer exists. And now the manipulator has what isolation always delivers: total, uncontested access. Isolation is not a side effect of abusive relationships. It is a strategy, deliberate or instinctive, conscious or automatic. It does not matter. The function of isolation is to remove every competing voice, every alternative perspective, every relationship that might give the target the resources, the confidence, or the reality check necessary to resist or leave. And it is executed with remarkable patience and ingenuity by those who use it. Because a manipulator who announces on day one, "I intend to separate you from everyone you love," would be left immediately. So it doesn't look like that. It never looks like that. It looks like love. It looks like need. It looks like reasonable preference. It looks like sensitivity and insecurity. It looks like so many other things before it looks like what it actually is. Let's trace the most common pathways through which isolation is executed, because the pattern is identifiable if you know where to look. The first pathway is jealousy framed as devotion. In the early stages of many manipulative relationships, the controlling person expresses what appears to be intense, flattering jealousy. "I just love you so much and I get scared when you spend time with other people. I know it's irrational, but I just get uncomfortable when you're around your male friends. It's not that I don't trust you. I just don't trust them." This is presented as vulnerability, as evidence of how deeply they feel for you, as something that requires your compassion and accommodation. And so, because you care about them and don't want to cause them pain, you adjust. You see that person a little less. You check in a little more when you're out. You make small concessions to their discomfort. Each concession is individually small enough to feel like a reasonable sacrifice for love. The accumulation of concessions, however, is not small at all. The second pathway is the weaponization of your relationships. The manipulator does not just express discomfort with the people in your life. They build a sustained negative narrative about each of them. Your best friend is toxic or a bad influence. Your sibling doesn't really care about you and has always been competitive with you. Your colleagues can't be trusted and are definitely talking about you behind your back. Your parents never really understood you, and their opinion shouldn't matter so much to you at your age. Each of these statements is delivered with apparent concern for your well-being. Each one is designed to preemptively discredit the person's voice before you have the chance to go to them for perspective. Over time, the manipulator has performed a kind of character assassination of everyone in your support network, and all of it has been done in the name of protecting you from people who are actually harmful. The result is that you begin to see your support network through the manipulator's eyes. You begin to find their company less comfortable, their opinions less trustworthy, their presence less nourishing. You pull away, not because they have done anything wrong, but because they have been systematically repackaged as threats. The third pathway is time monopolization. The manipulator does not necessarily forbid your other relationships explicitly. They simply ensure that every available unit of your time and energy flows to them. There are always plans when your other connections try to reach you. There are always needs that demand your attention. There is always a crisis, an emotional emergency, a moment of particular fragility that makes it feel selfish or even cruel to prioritize anything else. And because these aren't explicit demands but rather emotional realities that keep arising, you genuinely don't want to leave someone in distress. You genuinely feel the pull of the emergency. You accommodate them. And your other relationships, deprived of your time and attention, quietly atrophy. The people who love you stop calling as often. They assume you're busy. They respect what they interpret as your choice. They don't know that your availability was taken from you, not freely given away. The fourth pathway is geographic and structural isolation. This is the most explicit form, and often comes after the earlier stages have already reduced the social network significantly. Suggestions to move away from your city, your country, your familiar context, a new home that is inconveniently far from the people you know, a financial arrangement that removes your independent economic resources and makes you practically dependent on them for mobility, employment arrangements that limit your exposure to the outside world. Each of these moves is usually presented as a practical decision, a shared opportunity, a financial necessity, or an expression of their desire to build a life with you. The effect is the removal of every remaining foothold outside the relationship. Here is the diagnostic question. Look at your life now and compare it to your life before this relationship, or before this person became central to it. Are there fewer people in it? Do you see the people you love with less frequency, less ease, less joy? Have there been specific relationships, particularly those that were sources of honest feedback about your life, that have diminished or disappeared since this person became prominent? Has the version of yourself that existed independently with interests, friendships, a sense of yourself that had nothing to do with them, has that version contracted? If the answer to most of these questions is yes, you are looking at the footprint of isolation. The protection begins with the recognition that maintaining your independent social network is not a betrayal of any intimate relationship. It is a necessity. It is not something you owe the person who wants to isolate you to give up. A person who genuinely loves you does not need you to be alone in the world except for them. They do not benefit from your isolation. They are not comforted by the cutting of your social wires. Anyone who expresses relief when your friendships diminish, who is visibly more comfortable, the fewer outside voices you have access to, is someone whose relationship with you deserves the most serious examination you can give it. Because that comfort, in someone who claims to love you, tells you exactly what the love is for. Actively protect your relationships. Schedule them. Keep them alive deliberately, even when it requires effort. Even when circumstances make it inconvenient. Even when someone in your life makes you feel guilty for doing so. The breadth of your social world is the breadth of your freedom. And anyone who wants to narrow it is someone who profits from your confinement. Chapter 9. The foot in the door and the door in the face compliance traps that catch the best of us. The mind makes a decision once and then, very often, works backward to justify it. This is one of the most well-established and least flattering facts about human cognition. We like to believe that we evaluate evidence and then reach conclusions. The evidence suggests that we frequently reach conclusions through a combination of intuition, social pressure, and emotional response, and then build the rational case afterward. This tendency to feel committed to our previous decisions and to behave consistently with them is not a flaw in the programming. It is a feature. It creates reliability, identity, and social trust. When you say you will do something, the psychological discomfort of not doing it is a mechanism that generally serves you well, but it is also a mechanism that manipulators have learned to hack with extraordinary effectiveness. Two of the most powerful hacks are called the foot in the door technique and the door in the face technique. They work through opposite pathways, and they converge on the same result: getting you to agree to something you would not have agreed to if it had been presented to you honestly and upfront. Let's start with the foot in the door, because it is the more commonly used of the two, and it operates in more contexts than most people realize. The foot in the door technique works by first securing a small, easy, low-cost commitment from you, and then using your commitment to that small thing as a lever to extract progressively larger commitments later. It exploits the consistency principle, your psychological need to behave in alignment with your previous choices and your stated identity. It was first formally documented in a 1966 study by psychologists Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser, who found that homeowners who agreed to put a small sign in their window were significantly more likely, weeks later, to agree to have a large, ugly billboard installed in their front yard than homeowners who hadn't been asked for the small commitment first. The small yes created an identity. I am the kind of person who supports this cause. And that identity made the large yes easier to say. In daily life, this technique appears in forms ranging from mildly manipulative to seriously harmful. In commercial settings, a free trial that turns into a subscription, a small deposit that turns into a full purchase, a single favor that turns into an expectation of ongoing service. In political and social influence, a small expression of agreement with a moderate position that is then used to justify alignment with an extreme one. In personal and abusive relationships, the pattern of small, early concessions that establish you as someone willing to accommodate, then progressively escalate to demands and compromises you would never have agreed to had they been presented at the beginning. This last application is particularly important to understand because it describes the escalation pattern of many abusive relationships in precise mechanical terms. Nobody agrees at the start of a relationship to accept being screamed at. Nobody commits up front to tolerating being monitored, humiliated, or physically harmed. What happens is a gradual escalation, each step slightly beyond the last, each step building on the compliance that preceded it. The foot is in the door. The door is incrementally being pushed open, and at each stage, the target's identity as someone who has already tolerated this much, already given this much, already stayed this long, becomes a psychological anchor that makes it harder to step back and refuse what comes next. This is why a pattern of escalating behavior in any relationship where the demands grow, the boundaries shift, and the things you're being asked to accept become progressively more extreme, is one of the most important warning signals that exists. Not because any individual step in isolation is necessarily alarming, but because the pattern tells you where the trajectory leads. If you continue to let each small step establish the baseline for the next. Now let's turn to the door in the face technique, which works through a completely different and in some ways more elegant psychological mechanism. Rather than starting small and growing, the door in the face technique begins with an extreme, outrageous, or unreasonable request that the manipulator knows will be refused. The refusal is not a failure. It is the setup, because immediately after the refusal, the manipulator presents what appears to be a much more reasonable, much more modest alternative request, the one they actually wanted in the first place. And because you have just said no to something enormous, because you feel the social and emotional pull of reciprocity, they conceded something. They came down from their initial position. They compromised. You are psychologically primed to say yes to the smaller request. Even if, in isolation, the smaller request is still something you would have refused. The comparison makes it feel reasonable. The apparent compromise makes reciprocating feel like the fair and socially appropriate response. This technique was also rigorously documented in social psychology research and has since been applied in negotiation, strategy, sales, parenting, political lobbying, and abusive relationship dynamics. In a negotiation context, it is the reason many experts recommend opening with an offer that is more extreme than your actual target, not because you expect it to be accepted, but because it anchors the other party's perception of what is reasonable and makes your actual goals seem modest by comparison. In abusive relationships, it appears as a pattern of demands and apparent concessions, an extreme ask, followed by an "okay, fine, I'll settle for this," that still crosses a boundary you would otherwise hold. The concession performance makes you feel that you've achieved something. You've negotiated. You've said no to the big thing. So the smaller thing feels like a fair outcome rather than the thing they wanted all along. Here is how you protect yourself from both techniques. Because the defense for each involves the same fundamental skill. Evaluating every request in isolation, on its own terms, rather than in relation to what came before it. For the foot in the door, the question is not, given that I've already done X, should I now do Y? The question is, if X did not exist, if I had no history of previous compliance, would I agree to Y right now? If the answer is no, then the history of compliance is not a reason to say yes. It is a reason to pause. The fact that you have given something before does not obligate you to give increasingly more. The consistency principle serves you in many contexts. In the hands of a manipulator, it is a chain. Recognize when you are being asked to give, not because it makes sense to give, but because you have given before, and saying no now would feel inconsistent with your previous choices. For the door in the face, the question is, would I say yes to this if it were the only thing I'd been asked? Strip away the context. Strip away the extreme opening request. Strip away the apparent concession. Strip away the feeling that they've met you halfway. Look at the actual request, standing alone against your values and your limits. Does it cross them? Does it serve your interests? Would you have agreed to it if it had been the first thing you were asked? If the answer is no, then the sequence of how you got here is not relevant. You are allowed to say no. The fact that they came down from something bigger does not mean you owe them a yes. Chapter 10. Future faking promises as chains. One of the most painful experiences a person can have in a relationship is the slow, dawning realization that the future they have been planning, the future that gave them the reason to stay, the reason to tolerate, the reason to hope, does not exist, has never existed, was never going to exist, was a promise made not with the intention of being kept, but with the intention of keeping you in place, while the person making it got what they wanted from you in the present. The future was a fiction, and you built your emotional home inside it. That is the experience of a person who has been subjected to future faking. And if you have ever felt it, you know that the particular grief it creates is unlike almost anything else, because you are not just mourning a person, you are mourning a life that was shown to you with such apparent detail and sincerity that you allowed yourself to want it completely. Future faking is the practice of making detailed, believable, emotionally compelling promises about a shared future in order to secure compliance, attachment, or continued engagement in the present with no genuine intention of honoring those promises. It is not the same as broken promises made in good faith. People fail to keep promises. For 1,000 understandable reasons, circumstances change. Life intervenes. People's capabilities prove less than their intentions. Future faking is different. It is the deployment of the future as a tool. It is the use of tomorrow to extract what the manipulator wants from you today. The manipulator who uses future faking has understood, consciously or not, something crucial about human psychology. We are uniquely capable of enduring present difficulty in exchange for anticipated future reward. This is one of the most important cognitive capacities our species has. It is the mechanism behind every long-term investment, every education, every relationship that requires work and patience to build. We can tolerate a great deal of discomfort now if we believe, genuinely believe, that something we want very much is coming. Future fakers exploit this capacity with devastating precision. They paint the future in enough detail, with enough apparent sincerity, to keep the hope alive through whatever present difficulty they are asking you to endure. And the hope keeps you there. Not the relationship as it currently is, not the person as they actually behave. The hope, the future, the version of this story where everything becomes what they said it would be. Let's look at what future faking looks like in practice, across several different contexts, because it is not limited to romantic relationships, though that is where it causes the most profound damage. In romantic relationships, future faking often appears in the following forms: the elaborate shared future, when we get married, when we buy our house, when we have children, specific, detailed visions of a shared life, offered at moments of conflict, distance, or doubt. When you express uncertainty about the relationship, when you are on the edge of leaving, suddenly the future appears in vivid detail. The wedding venue, the city you'll move to together, the names of the children. It is specific enough to feel real. It is emotionally targeted at the thing you most want to believe. And, for a time, it works. You stay. The future that was promised does not arrive. When you bring it up, it recedes slightly. We'll get there. Just give me more time. Stop rushing things. But it never goes away entirely. It keeps appearing just when your hope is at its lowest, just when you are most ready to walk away. It is a leash built out of your own longing. In professional contexts, future faking appears as the perpetually deferred promotion. The raise that is always 6 months away, the leadership opportunity that is always contingent on just one more project completed successfully. The equity stake or partnership that has been discussed in compelling detail for years without ever materializing into a concrete offer. The employer or business partner who paints a compelling picture of where things are going, while indefinitely extracting your full effort and commitment in the present. In these contexts, future faking is often not experienced as manipulation at all. It is experienced as optimism, as a shared vision, as a relationship with a promising organization. The mechanism is the same. The future is being used to secure your present compliance. And the future, in many of these cases, was never the plan. In family relationships, future faking often takes the form of inherited obligation. When I'm older and you take care of me, when you've proven yourself, you'll get the inheritance. When things calm down, I'll support you the way you need. The future is always present in these relationships as a kind of promissory note, something owed, something coming, something that justifies the current imbalance, the current sacrifice, the current tolerance of behavior that should not be tolerated. And because it is family, because the attachment is primal and the longing for reconciliation and genuine connection is real and deep, the future promise finds particularly fertile ground. People wait decades for a future that a parent or sibling was never intending to provide. And waiting, enduring, accommodating that waiting, is exactly what the promise was designed to produce. How do you recognize future faking while you're inside it? Because that is the difficult part. From the outside, it can be clearer. But from the inside, hope is a powerful distorter of perception. The first signal is the timing of the promises. Genuine future plans tend to be discussed when things are going well, when the relationship is in a stable and positive state, when there is no particular emotional pressure driving the conversation. Future faking tends to appear specifically at moments of relational crisis, when you are upset, when you are distant, when you have expressed doubt or are on the verge of leaving. If the future only becomes vivid and detailed when you are pulling away, examine that timing carefully. A future that appears specifically to prevent your departure is a future being used as a retention device. The second signal is the ratio of discussion to action. In a relationship where the future is genuinely shared, the vision is accompanied over time by concrete, verifiable steps in the direction of that vision. Plans are made and followed through. Commitments are honored at the small scale, as well as the large. The future being discussed is visibly being built, even imperfectly, even slowly. In a future-faking relationship, the discussion of the future is not accompanied by corresponding action. There are always reasons why not yet, why the timing is wrong, why this particular moment isn't right. The vision remains vivid. The movement toward it remains absent. This gap between the richness of the described future and the absence of concrete progress toward it is one of the clearest indicators that the future is a fiction. The third signal is how they respond when you ask for specifics, timelines, or accountability. A person who is genuinely building a future with you can engage with specific questions. They can talk about a realistic timeline. They can acknowledge where things are currently falling short of what was promised and discuss what they intend to do about it. A future faker becomes defensive, evasive, or emotionally volatile when pressed for specifics. They may accuse you of being untrusting, controlling, or ungrateful. They may return to the vision with even more emotional intensity rather than engaging with the practical question. The escalation of emotional conviction in response to requests for concrete accountability is a pattern worth noting very carefully. The protection against future faking is learning to live in and evaluate the present. Not the future, not the promise, the reality of what is actually happening right now in this relationship between these two people, because the present is where you actually live. The present is where your well-being is actually determined, and a present that requires the promise of a future to justify enduring it is a present that, on its own terms, is not acceptable. Give appropriate weight to what a person consistently does, not what they say they will do. Give appropriate weight to patterns over periods of time, not to the emotional conviction with which a promise is delivered, and allow yourself, if the evidence calls for it, to grieve the future that was promised and will not arrive, because that grief is real and deserves to be honored. And then allow yourself, on the other side of that grief, to begin building a life in a present where the person next to you is doing what they said they would do, not because the future they described is beautiful, but because they are actually building it, one concrete, verifiable, honest step at a time. Chapter 11. Triangulation, the third party as a weapon. Picture this. You are in a relationship, romantic, professional, or familial, and at some point you begin to notice a recurring presence. Not always a physical presence. Sometimes just a name, a reference, an energy that enters the room whenever things between you and the other person become too comfortable, too settled, too equal. An ex who is mentioned with just enough lingering warmth to create a flicker of unease. A colleague who is praised in terms that feel specifically designed to land adjacent to your insecurities. A friend who seems to serve In every story they are featured in, as a quiet illustration of everything you are apparently not. You tell yourself you are being paranoid. You tell yourself you are overreacting. But you notice that whenever this third presence appears in conversation, something shifts in you. You try harder. You become more attentive, more accommodating, more eager to please. You become less focused on your own needs and more focused on theirs. You become, in other words, exactly what the manipulator needed you to become. And it happened not through a direct demand, not through an explicit request, but through the strategic deployment of someone else. That is triangulation, and it is one of the most psychologically sophisticated tools in the manipulation playbook, because its effects are almost entirely produced by your own mind. The manipulator barely has to do anything at all. Triangulation is the deliberate introduction of a third party, real or implied, present or absent, into a dynamic between two people, for the purpose of creating jealousy, insecurity, competition, or confusion in the target. The word comes from geometry, where a triangle is used to determine position and distance. In psychological manipulation, the triangle serves a similar function. It is used to calibrate and maintain the manipulator's position of power by destabilizing yours. As long as you are focused on the triangle, on who the third point is, what it means, where you stand in relation to it, you are not focused on the manipulator's behavior, on your own needs, or on the real quality and health of the relationship you are in. The triangle keeps you busy, keeps you off balance, keeps you oriented toward them as the center of a competition you never agreed to enter. Let's examine the most common forms that triangulation takes in practice, because it manifests differently depending on the context and the particular vulnerability the manipulator is targeting. The first and most recognizable form is romantic jealousy triangulation. This is when the manipulator introduces a romantic rival, real, exaggerated, or entirely invented, into the dynamic. The ex who texts at inconvenient moments and whose messages are left conspicuously visible. The attractive friend whose name appears with a specific frequency. The person at work who really gets the manipulator in ways that carry the quiet implication that you do not. The key feature of this form is that it is almost never stated directly. It operates through implication, through strategic vagueness, through information that is offered and then immediately walked back. The deniability is always built in. If you react, you are jealous and controlling. If you do not react, the message has still landed and is quietly doing its work. The manipulator has created anxiety in you without having technically done anything you can clearly point to. The second form is the comparison triangulation, which does not need a romantic element at all. Here, the third party is used not as a potential romantic replacement, but as a standard against which you are subtly or not so subtly found lacking. A sibling mentioned in terms of their extraordinary success. A previous partner who never made a big deal about things like this. A friend described as so easygoing, so uncomplicated, so low maintenance. A former colleague referenced precisely when you have done something that falls short of expectations. Each comparison delivers a message without stating it. You are inadequate. You are replaceable. There is a standard you are not meeting, and someone else is meeting it. And the emotional effect is the same as romantic jealousy triangulation. You become oriented toward proving yourself. toward closing the gap, toward earning the approval that is being withheld and dangled just beyond your reach. The third form is the alliance triangulation, which is particularly common in family systems and group dynamics. In this form, the manipulator cultivates a special relationship with a third party, a mutual friend, a family member, a colleague, and uses that relationship as both weapon and refuge. The alliance is selectively leveraged. The manipulator tells the third party a version of events, recruits their sympathy, and then references their support when in conflict with you. Your own mother agrees with me on this. I talk to your best friend, and even she thinks you are being unreasonable. The third party becomes an unwitting instrument. They are not aware of how they are being used. They have been given partial information and genuine emotional appeals, and they have responded, in good faith, with the support the manipulator sought. And now, that support is a lever. The fourth form is the phantom triangulation, the introduction of a third party who may not exist at all, or whose significance is entirely fabricated. Vague references to someone I have been talking to without elaboration. The suggestion that an alternative relationship or opportunity exists without any specifics being offered. A name dropped once and never explained. The manipulator does not need to actually have a romantic interest, a competitive colleague, or a dedicated family ally. They only need you to wonder. They only need the possibility to live in your mind, because your imagination, in the presence of attachment and insecurity, will construct a threat far more powerful than anything they could explicitly describe. The protection against triangulation begins with the decision to refuse to compete. This sounds simple and is genuinely difficult, because the instinct to compete, to defend your position, to prove your value, to close the gap is powerful and to some extent deeply natural. But competition is exactly what triangulation is engineered to produce. Every time you compete, you confirm that the third party has power over your behavior. You confirm that your security in the relationship is dependent on outperforming an alternative. You confirm that the manipulator's strategy is working. A genuinely healthy relationship is not structured as a competition. The moment someone is using the presence of others to regulate your behavior and extract your compliance, the relationship has become a game. And in that game, the only winning move is to step off the board entirely. Name what you observe, without accusation and without emotional escalation. I notice that this person comes up often when we are in conflict. I am not sure if that is intentional, but I want to name it. You are not accusing. You are making the implicit explicit. And making the implicit explicit is the single most powerful thing you can do to a triangulation strategy. Because triangulation depends entirely on your uncertainty, your self-doubt, and your inability to name precisely what is happening to you. Name it clearly and calmly, and the strategy loses most of its power. Chapter 12. Narcissistic Rage, When Control Fails, and the mask drops. There is a moment that many people who have been in close relationships with narcissistic or highly manipulative individuals describe with a particular kind of horror. Not the ordinary conflict moments, not the gaslighting or the gradual manipulation or the cold withdrawal. Those, over time, become familiar, even predictable in their rhythm. This is a different kind of moment entirely. This is the moment when the controlled, calculated, socially presentable face of the person they know seems to simply fall away. When the response to something, often something objectively minor, Something that any reasonable person would receive with mild irritation at most is so explosive, so disproportionate, so terrifying in its intensity that it feels like witnessing something that was not supposed to be seen. When the performance drops and something else is there instead, that something else has a name. It is called narcissistic rage. And understanding what it is, what triggers it, what it reveals about the person in front of you, and how to protect yourself from it, is among the most practically important psychological knowledge you can carry. Narcissistic rage is not the same as ordinary anger. Ordinary anger is a proportionate emotional response to a specific provocation. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It resolves when the underlying issue is addressed or processed. It is communicable. The person experiencing it can usually articulate what they are angry about. Ordinary anger, while uncomfortable, is a normal and navigable part of human emotional life. Narcissistic rage is categorically different. It is explosive, seemingly boundless, and wildly disproportionate to the apparent trigger. More importantly, it is not primarily about the trigger at all. It is a defense mechanism, a catastrophic response to a specific kind of internal experience that individuals with narcissistic psychological organization find intolerable above almost everything else. The experience of being exposed, contradicted, corrected, ignored, or treated as ordinary. To understand narcissistic rage, you have to understand what it is defending. Narcissistic personality organization, whether clinically diagnosable or existing across the broader spectrum of narcissistic traits, present in many people who would never receive a clinical label, is built around an extreme, fragile core sense of self-worth that requires near constant external validation to remain stable. This is sometimes described as a grandiose self-image that functions like an elaborate house of cards, impressive in its apparent solidity, catastrophically vulnerable to disturbance. The narcissistic individual has built their entire psychological architecture around the belief in their own exceptionalism, their superiority, their specialness. And this belief, to remain viable, requires the world and the people in it to continually reflect it back. When someone or something punctures that reflection, when they are genuinely criticized, corrected, refused, ignored, rejected, or simply treated as a normal person rather than a uniquely exceptional one, the internal experience is not merely unpleasant. It is experienced as destabilizing at a profound level. It is felt somewhere below conscious thought as an attack on the very foundation of the self. Narcissistic rage is the system's response to that destabilization. It is the psychological structure protecting itself with maximum available force. And because the internal threat feels existential, the response feels proportionate to the person experiencing it, even when it is completely incomprehensible and terrifying to everyone around them. What triggers it? Almost anything the narcissistic person interprets as a challenge to their sense of superiority, their right to control outcomes, or their image in the eyes of others. A mild disagreement that is heard as a categorical rejection of their intelligence. Honest and carefully delivered feedback that is received as a devastating personal attack. Not being consulted on a decision they feel entitled to govern. Being corrected in the presence of others. Having their version of events questioned. Being held accountable for something they did. Being treated with less deference than they have come to expect. These triggers can seem bafflingly trivial from the outside. That is because the rage is not about the triggering event. It is about what the triggering event represents to an internal architecture that cannot absorb ordinary human imperfection, challenge, or equality. The rage itself takes two main forms. The first is the explosion, the hot, immediate, volcanic eruption that most people associate with the word rage. Yelling, threatening, destroying property, making scenes in private or public, delivering devastatingly cruel verbal attacks that target precisely the other person's deepest known insecurities with surgical accuracy. This form is terrifying and visible, and at least leaves no ambiguity about what is happening. The second form is what is sometimes called cold rage or narcissistic withdrawal, a sudden, complete, punishing silence. The total removal of warmth, acknowledgement, and connection, deployed not as a genuine need for personal space, but as a calculated and prolonged punishment designed to communicate that your transgression warrants your exclusion from all relational warmth until further notice. Cold rage can ultimately be more psychologically damaging than the explosive kind, because it offers no confrontation, no resolution, no pathway to repair. It simply removes connection entirely and leaves the target in a state of anxious, confused, compulsive searching for what they did wrong and how to undo it. The protective knowledge here is twofold. First, a wildly disproportionate rage response to ordinary human behavior, to disagreement, to boundary setting, to honest feedback, to a straightforward no is diagnostic information. It tells you precisely about the psychological architecture of the person experiencing it and the degree to which your autonomy, your well-being, and your right to be a full human being in the relationship will always be secondary to the maintenance of their self-image. This is not a behavior that responds to better communication strategy, to more careful phrasing, to finding the magic words that allow accountability to land without triggering the defense. The problem is not your delivery. The problem is their fundamental inability to tolerate being challenged, and that inability will not be resolved through your increasing self-erasure. Second, the moment of explosive rage is a moment to prioritize your physical and psychological safety above all attempts at resolution. Not a moment for logic, not a moment for de-escalation through continued engagement. A moment to create physical space, to remove yourself from the immediate environment, if at all possible, and to assess your situation with clear eyes once you are somewhere safe. Rage of this kind is designed, whether deliberately or not, to intimidate, to install fear, and fear, once established through repeated exposure to explosive, unpredictable rage, becomes one of the most powerful and durable control mechanisms that exists. You begin, gradually and then completely, to organize your behavior not according to your own values and needs, but according to what will prevent the next explosion. Your life reorganizes itself around their volatility. That reorganization is the control mechanism, working exactly as it was designed to work. And seeing it clearly, naming it honestly, is the first movement toward refusing to live inside it. Chapter 13. Coercive Control, the Abuse that Leaves No Bruises. For a long time, the dominant cultural framework for understanding abuse, particularly within intimate relationships, was anchored almost entirely in physical violence. The harm was legible when it left visible marks. When evidence existed in a form that others could see, recognition became possible, sympathy became accessible, and the path forward, however difficult, was at least nameable. But for the vast majority of people who are being systematically and seriously harmed in relationships, there are no visible marks. There is no single dramatic moment of violence that functions as a clear line between before and after. There is instead something far more insidious, far more comprehensive, and in many ways, far more psychologically devastating. There is a sustained, patterned, systematic architecture of behavior designed to dominate, control, and subjugate another person's entire existence. It has a name that has only relatively recently gained the legal and clinical recognition it deserves. That name is coercive control. Coercive control is not a collection of individual bad behaviors. That distinction is critical, and it is the reason this form of abuse remained invisible to law, to medicine, and to broader culture for so long. Taken individually, many of the behaviors that constitute coercive control appear ambiguous, explainable, or even particularly to people outside. The relationship looking in like reasonable expressions of care, concern, or personal preference. The harm is not in any single behavior. The harm is in the pattern. The harm is in the systematic, comprehensive, relentless nature of the control, which accumulates over time into a total assault on the target's freedom, identity, and capacity for autonomous thought and action. Consider this way of thinking about it. If someone looks through your phone once, without permission, that is a violation. It is a meaningful breach of trust. But if someone monitors your phone every single day, controls who you are permitted to speak to, reads your messages in real time, demands you account for every person you communicate with, and creates serious and frightening consequences whenever contact with a non-approved person is discovered, that is not a violation. That is a prison. The profound difference between the individual behavior and the systematic pattern of control is the difference between a difficult moment in a relationship and a destroyed life. Coercive control operates simultaneously across every domain of a person's existence. It dismantles financial independence through control of money, sabotage of employment, and the engineering of economic dependency that makes leaving practically impossible without external support. It dismantles social connection through the isolation tactics we have already examined in depth, removing every relationship that might provide perspective, reality testing, or a safe landing place. It attacks physical freedom through the monitoring of location and movement, the regulation of appearance and dress, the control of daily schedule, and the management of access to transportation and communication. It attacks psychological integrity through sustained gaslighting, through the relentless erosion of self-esteem and self-concept, through the installation of a pervasive sense of inadequacy and unworthiness that eventually leads the target to genuinely believe they could not survive or function without the very person who is causing their harm. And it attacks identity itself, the foundational sense of who you are, what you value, what you are capable of, what you deserve, until the person who entered this relationship and the person who now remains inside it are barely recognizable to each other. One of the most important features of coercive control, and one of the primary reasons it is so extraordinarily difficult to leave, is the way it engineers its own perpetuation. Every component of the system works to make exit feel impossible. Financial control removes the practical means. Isolation removes the human support structure necessary to make and sustain the attempt. The erosion of self-concept removes the psychological belief that one deserves better or is capable of building anything beyond the relationship. The presence of fear, sometimes explicit through direct threats, more often maintained through the residual memory of past explosions and the constant ambient threat of future ones, removes the felt sense of safety necessary to act. And the intermittent warmth and apparent affection, woven strategically through even the most controlling relationships, because the good moments are never accidental. They are the maintenance mechanism that keeps the bond alive through cycles of harm, creates just enough attachment, and hope to sustain the person through each cycle. The system is complete. It is self-reinforcing. And understanding that architecture is the beginning of seeing how it can be dismantled. Recognizing coercive control from the outside is often as difficult as recognizing it from within. But consistent patterns do emerge. A person experiencing coercive control will typically show a progressive contraction of their visible world over the course of the relationship. They become less accessible to their social network, less present in shared activities, and less able to speak freely about their relationship when conversations do happen. Their language about their partner may shift from natural and balanced to careful, rehearsed, and quietly defensive. They may become hyper-vigilant in the presence of their partner, monitoring reactions, adjusting behavior in real time to prevent displeasure, physically flinching at unexpected sounds. They may express an opinion and then immediately reverse it when they appear to register how their partner receives it. These are not signs of a difficult temperament. They are signs of a person who has been conditioned, carefully and over time, to exist within a controlled environment, and who carries that conditioning into every space they enter. If you recognize this pattern in your own life, there is one thing above all others that matters for you to understand. What you are experiencing is not love, regardless of how it is labeled. It is not care, regardless of how it is framed. It is not normal, even when it has become so familiar that the shape of normal is no longer visible to you from inside it. It is a system of harm. And like all systems of harm, it has an exterior. There is a world beyond it. There are people and organizations specifically equipped and specifically dedicated to helping you find the path toward that exterior. A domestic abuse resource, a trusted person who exists outside the relationship sphere of influence, a therapist, a legal advocate reaching toward any of these, is not a betrayal of the relationship. It is the beginning of the journey back to yourself. Chapter 14. How to Rebuild After Psychological Manipulation, the Return to Yourself. If you have spent months or years inside a psychologically manipulative relationship of any kind, there is a specific shape of damage that does not repair itself simply because the relationship ends. The manipulator may be gone, the dynamic may be over, but the internal architecture that was constructed during that time, the distorted beliefs about your own worth and capacity, the hypervigilance, the flattened sense of your own needs, the trained inability to trust your own perception, the low-frequency constant anxiety that was once the ordinary texture of your daily existence in that relationship, that architecture does not automatically dismantle when the external cause of it is removed. You carry it, and until it is deliberately, carefully, and compassionately addressed, it quietly shapes everything that comes after. It shapes your new relationships, making you either reflexively avoidant of genuine intimacy or drawn, sometimes almost magnetically, toward familiar dynamics that feel recognizable precisely because familiarity was built in a house of harm. It shapes your professional life by installing beliefs about your competence and your worth that were placed there by someone who benefited from your diminishment. It shapes your relationship with your own mind by making self-trust feel dangerous, because self-trust was the thing that was most consistently and deliberately attacked. Naming this damage, clearly acknowledging that it is real, that it has a specific psychological shape, and that it responds to specific, targeted, patient healing, is not weakness. It is accuracy. It is the honest assessment of where you are. That is the absolute prerequisite for getting somewhere genuinely different. The first and most foundational step in rebuilding is reclaiming your own narrative. During a manipulative relationship, the story of who you are was largely written by someone else. You were defined by your failures, your inadequacies, your emotional fragility, your unreasonableness, your ingratitude. The story of what happened between you was shaped and then reshaped by the manipulator's version of events, delivered with a conviction that overwhelmed your own quieter, more uncertain account. Your version, your memory, your experience, your honest interpretation of what occurred was consistently invalidated, rewritten, or dismissed as evidence of your own dysfunction. Reclaiming your narrative means beginning, in whatever safe space you can find, to tell your own story again, in your own words, from your own perspective, without preemptively apologizing for it or softening it to protect someone who caused you harm. This happens in therapy, where the professional relationship creates a specific container in which your account is heard without being challenged or rewritten. It happens in trusted conversations with people who have no stake in defending the person who hurt you. It happens in journals where you write what actually occurred without censoring it for anyone's comfort. And it happens through the gradual, repeated, practice-by-practice discovery that your experience of your own life is allowed to exist exactly as you lived it. The second step is rebuilding your relationship with your own body and nervous system. Prolonged psychological manipulation, particularly the kind accompanied by emotional volatility, unpredictability, and fear, dysregulates the nervous system in measurable and deeply physical ways. The body learns to exist in a sustained state of low-grade alert. It scans constantly for threat. It responds to ambiguous signals with the threat response system that was accurate in the old environment. It interprets neutral situations through a danger detection lens that was necessary then and may not be appropriate now. This is not irrational. This is the body being entirely faithful to its experience, doing exactly what it was shaped to do. But it is also something that can be genuinely addressed over time, with appropriate support, through practices that communicate physical and psychological safety to a nervous system that has not felt safe in a very long time. Movement, breath, time spent in environments that are genuinely calm. Therapy modalities that work at the level of the body and the nervous system, rather than purely the cognitive level, approaches specifically designed for trauma that work, not just with what you think about what happened, but with how your body continues to hold what happened, long after the thinking mind has moved on. The third step is the slow and deliberate rebuilding of self-trust. This may be the most delicate of all the repair work, because self-trust was almost certainly the most targeted thing in the relationship. It was in the manipulator's direct interest for you to distrust your own perceptions, your own judgment, your own emotional responses, your own instincts. A person who trusts themselves is very difficult to control. So they worked, through gaslighting and criticism and the persistent dismissal of your perspective, to undermine that trust until the work of doubting yourself felt automatic. The rebuilding of self-trust is not a single insight or a single decision. It is a practice, accumulated across small, consistent acts of self-honoring. Following your genuine preferences about small daily choices, noticing when something feels wrong and allowing yourself to acknowledge it internally, without immediately arguing yourself out of it. Making decisions based on your own values rather than on the distorted beliefs you were taught about your own unreliability. Across many such small acts, practiced over time, the trust rebuilds. It does not announce itself dramatically. It simply becomes, one day, the quiet ground beneath your feet. The fourth step is relearning what genuine connection actually feels like in your body and your nervous system. Because if manipulation was your relational template for a significant period, the qualities of healthy relationships, steadiness, consistency, the absence of perpetual uncertainty and drama, genuine mutual regard, the experience of being fully seen without also being controlled or diminished, these qualities may feel strange at first, unfamiliar, perhaps even, in the earliest stages, somehow flat or insufficiently intense. This is the nervous system looking for the emotional registers it was trained on, the highs and the punishing lows of the cycle it knew. It is not evidence that the new relationship is wrong or that you are incapable of healthy connection. It is evidence of how deeply the old pattern was installed. And it passes, with time, with patience, with honest self-awareness, and with the gradual accumulation of evidence that safety is not the same as stagnation, and that steadiness, real, reliable, unchoreographed steadiness, is one of the most extraordinary gifts one human being can offer another. Chapter 15. The armor building a life that manipulation cannot enter. Everything we have covered in this video has been, at its core, about recognition, about seeing the tactics clearly, naming the patterns accurately, understanding the mechanisms precisely, and all of that is essential. But there is a layer of protection deeper than recognition, more durable than tactical vigilance, more powerful than any individual defense technique. It is the kind of internal solidity that makes you a genuinely difficult target for manipulation. Not because you are suspicious, or closed, or guarded behind walls, but because the ground inside you is stable enough that the techniques designed to destabilize you find no real purchase there. That solidity is not innate. It is not a personality type you either have or do not have. It is built. It is the product of specific, intentional, sustained work on the internal conditions that manipulation requires to take root. And building it is the final and most important thing this entire video asks of you. The first pillar of that solidity is a clear, deeply examined, personally owned sense of your own values. Not abstract principles borrowed from culture or other people. Not a performance of virtue designed to generate external approval. A genuine, lived, tested understanding of what matters to you and why. People with clearly defined internal values are significantly more resistant to manipulation. Because manipulation of almost every kind works by introducing ambiguity about what is right, about what you are worth, about what your obligations are, about what you deserve. When your values are clear and genuinely internal, the ambiguity finds less surface to grip. When someone tells you that you are wrong about yourself, you have a reference point that does not depend on their opinion of you. When someone attempts to rewrite the story of what occurred between you, you have an anchor in your own direct experience of how your values moved through the situation. Values are not merely moral philosophy. In the specific context of protection from manipulation, they are structural architecture. They are the frame that holds the self in its shape when significant external pressure is applied. The second pillar is genuine emotional regulation, not emotional suppression or the performance of having no strong feelings, which is ultimately a path toward fragility rather than strength, but the real and practiced capacity to experience difficult emotions fully without being entirely governed by them. Manipulation of almost every kind works by engaging your emotional system faster than your rational mind can organize a response. Fear, shame, guilt, jealousy, longing, grief. These are the primary levers. A person who can genuinely feel these emotions, acknowledge them without minimizing them, and nevertheless create even a brief pause before acting from them, is a person who is far less available to be moved by strategic emotional pressure. The pause is everything. The pause is where your freedom lives. That ability to observe an emotion rather than immediately becoming it is a skill. It is developed through experience, through therapy, through any practice that asks you to sit with discomfort without fleeing it or immediately complying with it. And over time, across consistent practice, it becomes a durable internal capacity. It becomes the space in which you choose rather than the space in which you are moved. The third pillar is honest, clear-eyed self-knowledge about your particular vulnerabilities. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable of the pillars to build, but it is absolutely non-negotiable. Manipulators do not choose their targets at random. They locate and then specifically exploit psychological needs, the need for approval, for love, for belonging, for validation, for stability, for being perceived as a good person, for being the one who rescues, for being needed and indispensable. Each of these needs is fully human. None of them are character defects or signs of weakness. But when a need is unexamined, unconscious, and operating without your awareness, it becomes a precise point of entry. The person who carries an unexamined need for approval will bend towards someone who withholds it strategically. The person with an unexamined need to rescue will find themselves repeatedly in relationships with people who need rescuing, because something in their unconscious pattern recognition was drawn to exactly that configuration before the conscious mind had a chance to evaluate it. Knowing your vulnerabilities does not mean eliminating the needs beneath them. It means knowing where the door is, so that when someone reaches for it, you notice the hand before the door opens, and you get to make a conscious, deliberate decision about what to do next. The fourth pillar is the cultivation and active, intentional maintenance of a rich and genuinely independent life. This is about more than social connection, though social connection is essential. It is about having sources of meaning, pleasure, identity, and grounding that exist entirely independently of any single relationship or any single person's perception of you. Work or creative practice that you find genuinely meaningful and that belongs entirely to you. Friendships that are maintained and invested in for their own sake, not as overflow from a primary relationship. A relationship with your own physical existence through movement, through rest, through care of the body that does not require anyone else's approval or attendance. A sense of yourself that is broader and more durable than any single role you occupy: partner, employee, parent, child, friend. A person whose entire sense of worth and stability is channeled through a single relationship or a single source of validation is profoundly and specifically vulnerable to whoever controls that channel. A person whose sense of self is distributed across many genuine, independently maintained sources of meaning and connection is not easily destabilized by the loss or corruption of any one of them. Build the breadth of your life deliberately. Protect it actively. It is not selfishness. It is the structural foundation on which everything else, every relationship, every creative pursuit, every expression of who you genuinely are is able to safely stand. The fifth and final pillar is the willingness to walk away from individual conversations, from dynamics that have shown you clearly what they are, from relationships whose cost, honestly assessed, exceeds what they genuinely give. This is not about avoidance of difficulty or unwillingness to do hard, honest, uncomfortable relational work. It is about the fundamental understanding that your continued presence in any dynamic is a choice you make and can unmake, and that the choice to remain always has to be weighed honestly against the actual present-tense cost of remaining. Manipulators count on your unwillingness to leave. They count on your emotional investment, your shared history, your hope, your fear of beginning again, your guilt about causing pain, your belief that what this relationship represents cannot be found again elsewhere. All of those things are real. Every one of them is meaningful, and none of them outweigh your right to your own integrity, your own well-being, and your own freedom to be a full and genuine human being in the world. The willingness to walk away is not cruelty. It is not failure. It is not the absence of love. It is a boundary, and a boundary that you will actually enforce, when it matters, is the most honest and ultimately the most powerful form of self-protection that exists. Here is the final thing. The people who manipulate, who gaslight, who love bomb and isolate, and future fake and triangulate and rage and control, the vast majority of them, are not cartoon villains constructed purely of malice. They are, in most cases, deeply damaged people enacting patterns that were built in them long before they ever met you, by damage that was done to them. Understanding this is not an invitation to excuse their behavior or to remain in its path. It is simply the truth. And the truth, all of it, the full, clear, honest truth about how human psychology works in both its darkest expressions and its most luminous ones, is precisely what makes you free. Because a person who genuinely understands the architecture of manipulation, who can see it clearly without being consumed by fear of it, who can love without being fooled by the performance of love, who can trust without surrendering their own judgment, who can be fully present in relationships without disappearing inside them, that person moves through the world in a fundamentally different way. Not as someone who is closed, as someone who is genuinely, durably, unmistakably open and safe inside that openness in a way that no one can take from them. You came here because something in you already knew that this knowledge matters. It does. It matters more than almost anything, because your mind, your perception of reality, your trust in your own experience, these are the most precious things you have, and now you know how to protect them.